Hello and welcome to Lecture 2, the alphabet. We've gotten through the front matter, so to speak, of the introductory material of the history and going over some English grammar, and so we can finally get into Middle Egyptian proper, the discussion of the first set of hieroglyphs that a beginning student of Middle Egyptian needs to learn, which is the alphabet. Now, hieroglyphs can play 5 different roles. There is, of course, the alphabet, which we're going to go over today, plus biliteral and triliteral signs that can stand for multiple letters, determinatives that apply extra shades of meaning to a word, and the rebus principle, a sort of word game wherein a picture of something can stand in for a word that it sounds like. The alphabet itself is almost all consonants. There are a few letters in the alphabet that can act as matres lectiones, which is a Latin term, which I'm mispronouncing, that roughly means mother of letters, and it refers to the practice of using a vowel approximate, like W or Y, to stand in for the vowel that it approximates, like U or I. This is very common among Semitic languages. Since many Semitic languages do not write down vowels, they will use a W or a Y to stand in for a vowel that might not otherwise be clear to the reader. The order of the Egyptian alphabet is kind of arbitrary. It was established a long time ago and is important because it's how dictionaries are ordered and that kind of thing, but it does not follow any particular pattern. It doesn't follow the order of the Semitic alphabets, nor an order based on like linguistic pronunciation of each letter. As well, on the note of pronunciation, there are conventional Egyptological pronunciations for each letter that may or may not be the same as how the Egyptians pronounced them. In some cases, they certainly were not the same, but these have been in use for a great many years, and the exact pronunciation of many letters is a matter of debate, so it's what we're stuck with and what is oftentimes used. The first letter in the alphabet is Aleph. It's represented by this sign, which is a vulture. It has an unclear pronunciation. It may have originally been a uvular R sound. It may have been an L or like a dark L like in Polish. It may have been Y. It may have been a glottal stop, which is the sound that you make between vowels as like just a stop in the airflow entirely. That final one is the position taken by Dr. Redford, my own instructor, who is also one of the most respected living Egyptologists, so I take his word on that. In Egyptological convention, it's a long ah sound, because the uvular R is a little tough for Egyptologists. It sounds something like ah, and dark L and glottal stop are also difficult. Glottal stop is not something that we usually consider a sound even, just kind of a break between sounds. And it's transcribed with a particular mark. Looks kind of like a 3. If you're writing for your own purposes, a 3 or a semicolon is perfectly sufficient, but if you're going for a publication, you should probably use that particular item, which you can find online just by looking up Egyptian Aleph. And it's 2 Semitic Aleph symbols, one on top of the other. The next letter, which is represented by a papyrus leaf, is called Yod, sometimes with an I, sometimes with a Y. The pronunciation is a little iffy. It could be a Y, it could be an I, it could be a glottal stop. It may have been all of these in different positions, which seems very probable. Conventional Egyptological pronunciation has it as an I at the end of a word or a Y at the beginning of a word. Unlike the letter Y that we're going to meet in a minute, it can occur in either position. And it is transcribed with an I. Sometimes it has a little comma-looking thing instead of a dot, which is the Arabic Aleph symbol, just to indicate that like this isn't really an I, but that's how it usually gets treated. Then you have Yod, which is written with 2 reed leaves or 2 strokes. That second one is an abbreviation that comes from hieratic, ancient Egyptian cursive. The pronunciation of this is unclear, definitely related to the I, because it's 2 of the I symbols, so clearly the Egyptians saw some connection. It may also be a Y or an I or a glottal stop. conventionally pronounced either as an I or a Y, and always transcribed with a Y. And you only find it, you'll find it occasionally in the middle, generally at the end of words, never at the beginning. There's no dictionary entry for Y because words that start with a y sound are all listed under I. That's the sound the Egyptians write down that as the beginning of words. Then you have lion. The original pronunciation is something that's hard for me to approximate. I'll do my best. It's like la. It's a sound that's common in Arabic and other related languages like Aramaic, and almost nowhere else. The technical name is the voiced pharyngeal fricative. Egyptological convention puts this letter as an A, which is much easier to pronounce, of course. And it's transcribed with a symbol that looks a lot like, but is not quite technically, an apostrophe. If you put in an apostrophe, everyone will know what you mean. That's good enough. But again, technically, it's a little semicircle rather than just a little mark. And then we have W, which also has two representations. One of them is a quail chick, which you'll find quite easy to recognize by the rounded body shape and the little wing. And the other is kind of a curlicue kind of thing, which you'll usually see at the end of words when the W is used to mark a plural. It is both pronounced and transcribed as W. It's usually treated as either a W or as like a long oo sound. Then we get into the consonants proper. All the vowels are listed at the beginning. The first consonant that we run into is B. I also have it listed with the Semitic name of the letter because I will sometimes use those instead, just out of habit from doing a couple of Semitic languages. So the Semitic name of B is Bet. And this one is quite simple. It's just a foot. You can draw it in your own representation in much sharper lines that it has here, and it will be easy to see. We're not totally clear on the pronunciation. It was either a B, which is how we conventionally pronounce it and transcribe it, or it was an aspirated P. An aspiration is when you have a puff of air as you say a word. English speakers do it naturally when a word begins with a P, a T, or a K, but we don't think about it, so it's hard for us to remember to do. But if you put your hand in front of your mouth, you'll feel an aspiration as a little puff of air that comes out. Compare the words pin and spin. You don't feel that puff with spin, you do with pin. That's aspiration. And the Egyptians may have phonologically distinguished it. We don't really know, unfortunately, because we're mostly working off of what Semitic languages wrote down these sounds as, because we know the values of their letters, and off of Coptic, which is much later than Middle Egyptian. Then you have P, which is pay in the Semitic languages. This one's pretty simple. The hieroglyph is just a square. It represented either a mat or a sitting stool. Either of those are equally likely. It was pronounced just as P, conventionally a P, transcribed as P. We have no questions about this one. P is one of the most common sounds across world languages, along with M and N. Pretty much the only major world language I can think of that does not have P is Arabic, and then also Farsi, which it picked that feature up from Arabic. But otherwise, it's very common. Then you have F. Middle Egyptian is kind of unlike the Semitic languages to which it is related in that it has F as an independent sound that occurs outside of just being a variant of P that shows up sometimes. That particular creature there is a horned viper. It's not the only snake we're going to see in the alphabet. It's important that you put the horns on it. That's how you'll know it's an F. It's got the two little things coming out of its head, because there are multiple snakes, like there are multiple birds, and it's important to get their features right, like the right angled head on the vulture and the little wing and round body of the W. F is also pretty clear. It was definitely an F sound, both in pronunciation and in Egyptological convention and in transcription. M, also known as Mem, that's the Semitic version of it, was represented with an owl. I actually don't love this representation in Unicode because one of the most important features of the owl is that it's got little pointy ears on top, and you can't really see that there. This one is drawn to a great degree of detail, which is not important to do. Really, it's sufficient to give it a square head, little pointy ears, and a triangle body and a little stick leg, and that's good enough. It's pronounced as M. That's also how it's transcribed. We're totally certain that this is an M sound because, again, those are very common, and the correspondences with Semitic languages in Coptic are there that Middle Egyptian had an M. N, you can also call it by its Semitic name of Nun, which works out pretty well because Nun is Egyptian for the primordial waters, and the symbol for M is a little bit of water, a ripple specifically. It is also pronounced as N, conventionally N, transcribed as N. Then we get back into letters that are a little bit more tricky. The letter R, also known as Resh, with the Semitic version. That symbol there is a mouth, which is not immediately obvious, but those are lips without a line between them. That's where you get that shape. It's mostly pronounced as R, but it seems to have been kind of interchangeable with L, and the form of R it was probably something weak that could be interchanged with L, like the English R, or maybe like a light tap like ra. It was not very likely either the uvular ra or the Spanish rolled ra, which have very strong distinct sounds and don't tend to flip with L, as sometimes happens in languages, and which seems to have happened in Egyptian. By Middle Egyptian, that weak R was starting to be dropped in some circumstances, and there may have been points, especially at the ends of words, where this letter was just silent. Conventionally, we just pronounce it as R. In the different languages where Egyptian is studied, the main ones being English, German, and French, at least among European languages, those languages may have different pronunciations for R. Germans will do la or ra, and French always la. So it's just whatever your language's R is good enough for this. And it's transcribed with an R. This is the letter H, also known as Hey, from the Semitic languages. It's a picture of a small, simple house plan. You have an entryway and a little walled-off living area. Looks almost like a spiral. This one is just your typical English H. Very common across languages. We're pretty certain about this one as well. The next H sound is written with an H with a dot. It's sometimes called dotted H. A more appropriate name is probably het, from the name of this letter in Semitic languages. It is pronounced like the H in Muhammad, which is a little difficult for English speakers to say, myself included. It's the voiceless version of the ayin from earlier. Conventionally, it's pronounced either like an H or like a KH sound, which is a velar fricative, and it's transcribed with an H like a dot. And yeah, this one is probably one of the most mispronounced because we know the pronunciation and simply can't do it. So do not feel bad if you yourself cannot do it, as I myself cannot. The next letter is what's often called circle H. I like to call it ach, because this is that velar fricative I was talking about earlier. It occurs in a lot of languages, not in most dialects of English, although a few have it. It shows up in Scottish versions of English, like with the pronunciation of the word loch, for example. The Germans call this the Achlaut because it's pronounced when there's a CH following an A, as in the German word ach in that language, so I like to call it ach as the letter. And it's transcribed with that H with a circle. The hieroglyph is, no one knows what it is. It might be a placenta. That's the current best working theory. It's a circle with some lines through it, and we don't know anything more than that. Also, because I briefly missed it, that is a piece of knotted rope. That's the het. Then you have H bar. H bar, also known as ich, again, that's just me, it's not super common, is a sound that we don't know a ton about. The most likely candidate is that it's the CH in ich, aka a voiceless palatal fricative. We say it in the words like hue, where the letter H is followed by a Y sound. The hieroglyph that represents this sound is probably the underside of a cow or other large mammal, but we don't really know. Transcribed with an H bar. But yeah, that hieroglyph is a little bit confusing probably one of the hardest ones to write, which is why it is good that writing hieroglyphs is not a terribly common thing to be tested on. Then you have S. There are two symbols for S, and they are quite distinct. The two symbols for Y and W are interchangeable totally, but the symbols for S are not interchangeable. They are distinct, and it is important to keep them separate in spelling words. The horizontal S was originally a Z in Old Egyptian, or it might have been something a little different, like a TS sound or something like that. We don't really know. It was an S with something changed about it. And that sound merged into S as Old Egyptian became Middle Egyptian. So the two letters became redundant, but certain words are only spelled with one or the other, and occasionally they'll get switched up for aesthetic purposes, but mostly it reflects the history of the word. And it's just pronounced as S in Egyptian and in the modern rendering and transcribed with the letter S. Then you have sharp S, aka, I guess you could call it S hat or S brave, or shin, which is what I'm most likely to call it. That's the Semitic version. It looks like a rectangle. What that rectangle represents is a pool, the kind of thing you might have in a palace garden or something like that. It's pronounced like an SH, conventionally SH, and it's transcribed as an S with a little reverse caret on it. Oftentimes, again, it's just called making it sharp or a brave, B-R-E-V-E. Then you have the letter Q, or Qaf. It's represented by this little hill, and it may have been pronounced either like the Qa in Arabic or as an ejective K. And ejectives are a category sound not found in English. It would sound a little like this, Ka, like you're blowing all the air out of your mouth as you're saying it. It's hard for an English speaker to do because it's not terribly common. Conventionally, it's either pronounced like a K if you don't really know your Semitic languages, or like Ka if you do, where you're and again, I'm probably screwing that up, but you do your best to pronounce it from your uvula rather than from the middle of your palate, the velum. It's transcribed with a Q. Then you have Kaf, not to be confused with Kof. Pay attention to the vowel, which is just a K. It's represented with this little bowl with a almost like a handle kind of thing on it. Pronounced like a K, transcribed like a K. Quite simple. And then we have G, Gamal. This is a little confusing because the relationship between this sound, K, and Kof is not really well understood. It's possible that G was an ejective K and Kof was a Q. It's possible that Q was an ejective K, G was a G, or they're both Q and G. We don't really know, but we pretend that it's G because it's much easier to say G than that ejective sound, and it's transcribed as a G as well. And then that hieroglyph there is another kind of stool. Then we have T, which is Toph, one of the two T sounds in Semitic languages. The symbol is a semicircle, which represents a loaf of bread. And this also appears in the word for loaf of bread. It's pronounced like T in Middle Egyptian. We're pretty certain of that because a lot of Afro-Asiatic languages have a T that marks femininity, and Egyptian certainly does. Occasionally, it seems like this was omitted at the end of words when it was a feminine ending. They might have done what Hebrew did and had some words that just ended in a T be an ah sound or some other vowel as that feminine ending, not the original ot or et or whatever it was. And yeah, conventionally pronounced T and transcribed T. Then you have a T with an underline. Hoch gives the name for this as Chima, which I rather like. There's also Teth, which is the emphatic T in Semitic languages. It's represented by a length of rope with like little loops at either end. Looks almost like a bola. was pronounced like a CH sound in English, or an ejective T, or a palatal fricative, or stop, or TS. Actually, I believe it should be palatal stop and not palatal fricative there. In other words, we don't know. We have almost no idea what sound this was. There's a ton of debate about it. I personally lean towards that it was a CH, because it makes for a very nice mirrored pair with the D and the D underline that we're going to meet in a minute. But we don't know. The jury is very much still out on this sound. Conventionally, it's pronounced as the ch in church, and it's transcribed with a T underline. Then we have just the regular D, which is dalet. The symbol for that is a hand, not the full arm. That would be I in just the hand. It's pronounced like either a D or it was an ejective T. We don't know which one of those it was. Again, I lean towards D because we have B and G, so it would make sense for there to be a D. But, again, not totally clear. Conventionally, pronounced D and transcribed D. We just pretend that it's that because it's easier than the ejective. Then we have D underline, or D bar. The technical name for this given by Hoke, which I really like a lot, is Janja. It's represented by another kind of snake, specifically a cobra about to strike. You can see it's kind of reared up almost. You'll find that this is also a hieroglyph that is designed conveniently to have other hieroglyphs fit under it. When we finally get into actually reading hieroglyphs, then we will cover how that works. It's pronounced like a J in English, not like the J in French or German, which is just the Y sound. Or it may have been an ejective palatal stop, or an ejective T, or a sound like Z. We just don't know that. Conventionally, we pronounce it as a J, though, which is what I lean towards. And it's transcribed with a D with an underline or bar underneath it. And if you're using this not as just a thing to watch through, but as a program of learning, the thing you should do after watching this video is practice the alphabet, like a lot. When I first learned the alphabet, I just sat down and filled a sheet of paper with the letters and their English equivalents over and over. It's not important to get the writing fully correct. You can do just approximations of the most important features of the letters, because some of them are complicated. For example, Janja, I just draw that as a squiggly line in the correct shape, because that adequately conveys what letter is being discussed. What matters is that you're memorizing the general shape and value of each letter. That is what's really important. Once you've done that, then I recommend moving on to the next video, because we are going to be covering the other 4 kinds of letters, and possibly also how the Egyptian letters or Egyptian hieroglyphs fit together.